Okay, I think it's gone 8 o'clock, and let's get started. So welcome everyone to this Population and Association of Singapore's online discussion called Singapore's Population in 2022, Unpacked. This was organized in conjunction with the publication of two major demographic or population releases by the government 2 weeks ago. Firstly, the Population in Brief report, and also a much more extensive release of population information in Population Trends. Both these documents are on the relevant websites and accessible. What I thought I'd do is firstly introduce the three speakers tonight. And when I say speakers, there are people who are going to kick off the conversation about the key themes that were in the Population in Brief report. We'll talk about marriage and fertility. We'll talk about aging, population aging, and we'll talk about migration during the course of tonight's session. We have Professor Jin Yong, who's the chairman of the Population Association of Singapore, but she's also the center director, the founding director of the Center for Family and Population Research at the National University of Singapore. We also have Dr. Abhijit Bisaria, who is at Duke NUS, the Center for Aging and Research on and Education, and Dr. Associate Professor Walter Tessera, Associate Professor in Economics from the Singapore University of Social Sciences. And I thought what I'll do is first run through some of the key highlights as I see it from the Population in Brief report, very quickly go through that and then hand it over to our speakers. But please feel free to treat this as an informal session. Please send in your comments on the chat, but also I'm hopefully expecting a good discussion after the opening remarks from each of the speakers. So please, without further ado, let me just kick off with the quick intro. I'll share my screen and take you through some of the key indicators from Population in Brief. So this is what we have. 2022, June 2022, we saw a rebound in the resident and citizen population in Singapore. The non-resident population also rebounded after the trough in 2020 and 2021 because of COVID, of course. We also did see that the age profile of the population, both citizens as well as the resident population, but clearly here in Population in Brief, it focuses more on the citizens that aged, and now 18.4% of the citizen population is aged 65 and above. And this is on a total resident population basis on track to rise to 1/4 by 2030. Marriages and births were also affected by the pandemic. So you saw that effect in 2020 as well as in 2021 as marriages and births were postponed. But we saw a rebound in those numbers as well. So births and marriages first and births. But they are still below the long run averages from previous periods. This is the composition of the total population. So resident population about just over 4 million, of which 3.55 million are Singapore citizens. We have 500,000 odd permanent resident population, which is at the low end of the range as guided in the population policy announced back in 2013. We also have the non-resident population at 1.56 million. And this, as I said earlier, is a bit of a rebound from the previous years, primarily in the group that is construction, marine, and process work permit holders. In terms of marriage and parenthood, you see some numbers here. You saw that rebound in the marriages on the left-hand side. You can see here 23,400 citizen marriages. This is involving at least one citizen. But we also see the proportion of the singlehood rates across pretty much all of the age groups here, both males and females, rising over this period. In terms of immigration, sorry, this is not immigration. There's still, hang on, why am I going to immigration so quickly? Apologize, this has interrupted my my flow. Immigration, in terms of immigration, we've got this profile of transnational marriages, which dipped unsurprisingly in 2020 and 21 because of COVID. International travel was restricted. And then on the right-hand side is the population pyramid, which is showing the, I would almost say, an aging of the permanent resident population too, that's denoted in blue. I've come to the end. It's unfortunately, I've skipped quite a few slides that I had. I apologize. Anyway, maybe we can just move on to the speakers then, and maybe we can ask Jean to start off with her thoughts from population in brief. Jean?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for everyone joining us tonight. I think the big high points that people are talking about this population in brief. The report is, of course, we're happy. Everyone's happy to see the increase in marriage rate and also fertility rate. And of course, the big question there is, is this a long-term trend that we're going to continue to see next year and the year after, an increasing trend of marriage and fertility rate? Or is this more of a short-term fluctuation caused more by the COVID-19 pandemic event that we have experienced in the last 2 years? So a quick look across time, also across different countries' experiences, I think lead me to suspect that this could possibly more likely to be a short-term fluctuation rather than a long-term trend. And other countries have also seen this because of the COVID-19, the uncertainties in economies. Some lost jobs, some lost a lot of incomes because of the social distancing and because of all the travel restrictions. Marriage rate and fertility rate across the globe has dropped. And the last year we have seen a small increase back to what it was before. And so I think in Singapore, this is also likely to be the case. In particular, because here in Asia, in Singapore and in other Asian countries, marriage and fertility rates are closely coupled because non-marital birth are not acceptable here. So due to the COVID-19, we have seen a big drop of the transnational marriages, the chart that Chris had shown earlier. Before COVID-19, you have seen that we have about 37% of the annual marriage that are between a Singapore citizen and a foreign spouse. And that has dropped a lot during the COVID-19. And so as a result of the decline in the marriage rate, fertility rate dropped as well. And that you can see in different ethnic groups too. So I think that's what's going to happen probably. Other indicators also shows that the percentage of marriage at different age group who remain single did not change very much. And you see at the higher age, in fact, there's a bit of increase of people remaining single last year as well. So I think all indicators probably points to that this is more likely to be a short-term fluctuation than a long-term trend. But we're very happy to see that marriage and fertility rates did not continue to decline in 2022. These are all good signs, and later on we can talk more about what to do and your comments too, your views as well. The other more important things in this report obviously are the aging trend and the implications for immigration, which Abhijit and Walter will be talking about after this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Yeah, so that's a nice intro to Abhijit, who will talk about aging. Thanks, Abhijit. Thanks, Jean.
Sure. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to PS for organizing this. A few thoughts on the population in brief. One, I think, as Chris mentioned right at the outset, I think what is laudable in Singapore is the fact that we also have the population trends. The report come out, I think, at around the same time. And I think for people who want more details, who also want to look at the profile of Singapore's population distribution, and population aging from the point of view of the resident population in Singapore, not just those of citizens. I think population trends provides that information as well. So it gives a wider range of demographic indicators. So I think everybody interested should look certainly at both. Couple of sort of quick thoughts. One, I think although population in brief and I think population trends both mention the fact that the proportion of the population in Singapore, resident or citizen population age 65 and over, has certainly gone up compared to 5 years ago, compared to even 10 years ago. I think this was expected, right? This is not news in some sense. The numbers are what were expected. This information has been out there. The population in brief in particular also talks about the fact that the cohort of baby boomers, right, those ones that were born in post-World War II years, which is 1946 through 64, 1946 to 64 birth cohorts are now aging. And these were large cohorts of individuals born right after World War II as marriage rates increased, as childlessness went down, as people started having more children. So I think the other point to note, a related point to note, is that again, if you look at the population pyramid that Chris showed, the age cohorts 55 through 59 are actually 55 to 64 are actually the two largest groups, right? So expect that the proportion, and these will over the next 10 years age into the age cohort of 65 and over. So expect this proportion of the population age 65 and over to increase, right? So it shouldn't surprise anyone. So that was one, and I thought, I mean, let me just sort of say one thing, sort of kick things off by saying something that is, I guess, the most intrinsic, in some sense, aspect of aging, and which is health. One of the things that we've also heard around in recent times is the idea of the healthier SG strategy that the government is following, and the reason why I think that is extremely timely is because I think it is getting to the heart of what chronic disease management in particular and lowering rates of progression to worse health states, for example, what a strategy that can address these things. So as life expectancy is going up, the pace of health adjusted life expectancy in Singapore has not kept pace with life expectancy increases in Singapore. But what the healthier SG strategy does is that it's trying to get at both increasing diagnosis, both increasing sort of more regular use of healthcare, more screening, which will mean that in the short term, it is very possible the diagnosis rates of chronic diseases might go up, but progression to worse health and living with chronic disease will certainly improve. And therefore, there may be less of a pressure, so to speak, on the healthcare system. So just to sort of address that most intrinsic part in some sense of aging, which is health, right up front.
Yep. Thanks, Abhijit. Over to Walter. I think you wanted to touch on some matters relating to the transnational marriages, but also maybe also some thoughts, if you have any, on the impact of this aging trend on the economy, the workforce. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks. Okay, so I guess they're related because one of the reasons why transnational marriage is important is this is actually potentially a large source for your future population, right? It's actually one of the main ways that one of the more important ways that new people get assimilated into Singapore. And so a couple of remarks here. First, we can see that the share of citizen marriages, which are transnational, have been quite high for a very long time. The data in the most recent report goes back to the early 2010s, but actually there are some reports you can download from NPTD, and it shows that this proportion, close to 40%, was actually, well, not 40%, but the numbers at least were actually already quite high even in the 2000s. About 8,000 marriages a year are actually transnational. And obviously the trend has very significant implications for assimilation, as well as the opposite direction, emigration, right? Because Singaporeans who get married to non-Singaporeans may also choose to leave permanently. It's not just one way. And when you look at the numbers of 8,000 a year transnational, we don't know what is the breakdown between marriages to permanent residents, pass holders, whatever it is. But this could be potentially a very large chunk of the permanent residents who are granted eventually, if many such marriages are to non-PRs. And we don't know the statistics, but again, when you look at the population pyramid, to me, it was very suggestive that the population pyramid is actually, on the PR side, quite apparently imbalanced in favor of female PRs, which would be suggestive of some kind of, assimilation on that basis. Okay, so what do we know about all of this? Well, like I said earlier, NPDD doesn't seem to publish data on the distribution of these transnational marriages to the immigration status, and therefore we do not know what proportion is PR, pass holder, completely foreign. But the COVID-19 experience is very interesting because it gives us an indication of how many of these marriages are to foreign partners who are not typically resident in Singapore. Okay, so the assumption I'm going to make here is that in non-COVID years, you can marry any foreigner except those who are somehow, I guess, are legally barred from going to Singapore. But during COVID-19, the interesting thing is all non-residents more or less get barred from going to Singapore. Okay, so that's the interesting thing. And so the reduction over COVID-19 was from about 35 to 37% of marriages, transnational, to about 30%. Okay, and so if you assume that this drop is due to marriages which would have been made otherwise by somebody who doesn't have residency rights in Singapore, then one possible guesstimate is maybe 1 in 5, transnational marriages actually involve a foreign partner who's non-resident in Singapore, which to me seems very substantial, right? If it's really true that 1 in 5 transnationals involve a foreigner who's not resident here, well, who are these people and how do these ties get formed, right? I mean, of course, we know that historically, there's all this matchmaking that goes on that caters to certain demographics in Singapore, but there could also be, marriages from travel, meeting here and abroad, things like that, much more non-formal arrangements. Okay, another point to make on this topic is that there is, I think, suggestive evidence of substitution between transnational and local marriages, okay? So when you look at the total number of citizen marriages, there was a big drop, 10% plus in 2020, but it rebounded to above the pre-COVID level in 2021. So over the 2-year COVID period, I think in aggregate, you have maybe about 5% less marriages than you might expect from pre-COVID trends, okay? So if you suppose that every Singaporean who normally would have gotten married transnationally would remain single instead. Okay, they don't get married at all, right? We should actually have seen a much larger reduction in total marriages. I think we probably would have seen maybe 7 to 8% reduction in marriages over COVID instead of just 5% less. And this difference tells me that there is substitution. In other words, not insignificant proportion of Singaporeans who would have gotten married transnationally actually got married to locals instead. Or, that's what I think. All right, so where do we go from here? I think a lot of attention historically has been on a certain type of transnational marriage, maybe a stigmatized type, which is characterized by older Singaporean men, lower SES, marrying much younger foreign women from developing Asian countries. That has been the stereotype and somewhat stigmatized stereotype, okay, in the past. And of course, we know some of the sociological and economic reasons for this. But I think the substitution that we see during COVID, transnational local, is quite different from that. I would assume that this group of marriages probably wouldn't have been able to find partners in Singapore anyway during COVID. So I'm guessing that a lot of these marriages, in fact, do involve Singaporeans with some degree of choice locally. They're not considered unmarriageable locally by any means. And so I think this is actually an area that could use a lot more study, I think, but we don't know much about that, okay? So that's one broad area. The other thing I'll talk on a bit more, I think will be a bit about aging and immigration. But here I think what I want to suggest is that we probably need to think of better ways of measuring and thinking about some of these issues. Well, what do I mean by that? The issue is that I think for a long time, we have been publishing certain statistics, such as the old age support ratio, for example, which don't really make a lot of sense in our context. The reason why they don't make a lot of sense in our context is that we have been publishing some of these aging statistics and employment-based statistics based on the resident population. We have not been publishing them based on the total population in Singapore, which includes non-resident workers. And I guess the result of that is in some way to make it look as if we have a much more severe demographic aging and employment crisis than we actually do. Okay, because if you publish the numbers based only on the resident population, that's actually the group where aging really bites. But if you were to include the non-resident population, those are almost all selected into Singapore on the basis of them being young workers. That's where the bulk of the non-resident population is. And that changes the numbers substantially. Okay, now as for why we don't publish those numbers, why we don't look harder those numbers, I don't know. I mean, my only guess is that there's some kind of strange political decision to do it that way, maybe to make the situation look worse than it actually is. But the point I'm saying is that it's not that bad once you account for the fact that policy deliberately chooses to, to let in people who counteract our aging demographics, right? That's what policy actually does. And that's the differentiating factor between Singapore and many other Asian countries. So in a sense, the numbers we're looking at, this percentage of the population above 65, the support ratio, these are all the wrong numbers that we're looking at because they are missing the elephant in the room, which is, these 1 million, foreign workers in Singapore, which completely change all of these numbers. But of course, having said that, the longer term things to think about are really, in some sense, the sustainability of the foreign workforce, which is going to be quite different from that of the domestic workforce, particularly as foreign economies, which send a lot of lower wage workers to Singapore, develop economically more rapidly. And because of that, the cost advantages of importing these very large numbers of foreign workers to correct the demographic imbalance, that cost is likely to change a lot. And of course, the other big cost that is uncertain is the willingness of the population to accept these numbers going forward, which seems to be more and more in question with each passing year. So these are some of the things I am thinking about. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chris. And yeah, I think that's all for now.
Thanks, Walter. Okay, so what I thought I'd do is put up that slide again, because I think all three of you talked about this population pyramid, and maybe we can spend a little bit more time looking at that pyramid. On the right-hand side is that population pyramid. Again, unfortunately, from Population in Brief, it's mainly focused on the citizen population. But I think the trends that I think I'm going to be talking about and referring to are also pertinent to the resident population. As Walter says, we don't have information about the age structure, the age profile of the non-resident foreign population or the non-PR foreign population in Singapore. But I would suggest that they sit generally mostly in the working ages. They are slightly differentiated by gender and in terms of what they are in Singapore to do. But mostly speaking, you can presume that they are in the working ages all the way up to maybe in their 40s and as young as 20. And they fill out that dip, that slimming of the pyramid in amongst the Singapore population, the citizen population, at least in this chart. You know, between the 30s, 35s, 35-year-olds, and to all the way up to 54. Right. This is the baby boomers, the late baby boomers that Abhijit was talking about, that will move into the 65 and above category over the course of the next decade. And this is the group that is, you know, really going to push Singapore into that super aged population category. And of course, then we have fewer births than people hitting that 65-year-old threshold. The other thing that I thought I would point out is this this bulge in the age group 25 to 34. For both men and women, it's more pronounced for men than it is for women. But this is what has been considered to be an echo boom, echo boomer. The age these baby boomers gave birth to proportionately more children, and because of that, we had this echo in amongst the baby boomers. So this was the echo boomer cohort that we would have hoped to have more marriages amongst them, and therefore more births. And I think maybe COVID has had an impact on that, you know, in terms of reducing the birth rate amongst this group somewhat. So yeah, maybe just some sort of thoughts following on from our opening remarks from the three speakers. You know, any more points that any of the speakers want to make on this before we start to ask questions?
Chris, if I may, Chris.
Go ahead, Jing.
I just want to say that about the marriage rate. You know, the decline of the marriage rate in the last, you know, after the COVID is not just caused by the decline of the transnational marriages. A portion of that is also, and probably a substantial portion of that, is the postponement of the marriages that are, you know, not part of the transnational marriages statistics. And this is a historical trend. When you have a crisis of either financial or natural disaster or these kind of instability, people postpone their major life events, and either getting married or having baby or having a second birth, a new baby, they postpone it. So part of it is postponement of the marriage that was caused by the first year's big decline in that caused the first year's big decline in marriage. And then the catching up in 2022 is partly also these people, the postponements have people decided to get married after this 1 year or 2 years postponement. So that is part of the equation as well.
Cool.
And about the your chart on the population pyramids. One thing to also point out is that the childbearing woman in the childbearing age is going to start to decline soon, because as you can see there, the age 20, 24, 15, 59, that's now a much smaller cohort from then on. So when we think about potential number of births in the next decade, we should take that into account. The actual number of women who are going to be in the childbearing age will decline soon. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Jane, for pointing that out. Clearly, we can also worry about the TFR, the rate, total fertility rate, but you're pointing out the fact that the actual numbers of women of childbearing age will decline in numbers. So we might actually end up still, even if we do push up TFR to maybe 1.3, 1.4. That would still not necessarily lead to an increase in the total number of births. Thanks for that. Abhijit, any more sort of points that you want to make about the aging trend? You
Sure.
talked about the health policy. Are there any other sort of points that you think are relevant here on the aging side?
I think, again, taking off from what the population in brief does, right? Sort of what it does is that it presents the populations of Japan and South Korea. I think juxtaposes that with that of Singapore, which is interesting. I think one does tend to look within East Asia or within Southeast Asia, where there are aging populations or aging societies, how Singapore is doing. 2 points to mention. One, that the pace of aging, right? We call Singapore a rapidly aging society or a rapidly aging country. It is in fact one of the fastest aging societies. There's this idea of how long does it take for the population of older adults, age 65 and over, to double from 7% to 14%, and then increase by another 7% from 14% to 21%. And Japan, interestingly, which I guess went from 7 to 14% in between 1975 and 1995, took 20 years. Singapore took only 16 years to do that, from I think about 2005 to recently in 2021. And to go from 14% of the population, resident population, aged 65 and over, to reach 21%, Singapore will only take about 8 years. Japan took 13 years. From 1995 to 2008. Other aged societies in the world today, you look at the US, you look at several European countries where the proportion is higher. Japan is the highest in the world, but you look at Italy and Portugal and various Western countries, they took many decades to achieve these, this level of population aging. So I think the challenges that I think Singapore has to adjust to an aged society, or a society where there are a high number, but certainly a significant proportion of older adults, I think are unique challenges. And there are a bunch of areas, and we can certainly talk about it in the next half an hour. I think employment being one, productivity or productive engagement in society being another, living arrangements and housing being, I think, another priority area, and health, as I've already mentioned. I think these are certainly challenges that Singapore has, but I will say, from my vantage point, I think particularly, just on the context of healthy RSG, where the idea is that, right, so people will live longer in Singapore. We know that than they have in the past. And even if they have chronic physical ailments, they can live with fewer limitations. And I think that is what the strategy is trying to achieve. So longer lives don't necessarily need to be spent with poor health caused by physical ailments. So I think the challenges are significant, but I think it certainly seems that there's movement happening on each of these fronts, on employment, on living arrangements, on productive engagement.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Abhijit. this pace of aging is clearly unprecedented. And I think I've looked at some statistics. It's South Korea and Singapore that are certainly in this region aging the most rapidly over the course of the next 10 years. Right. It does have significant implications, particularly for social support. Our social support is predicated on productivity and is applied to those that are mostly in work. And it's very difficult, to tell somebody who is in their 50s, to really change their employment prospects, and do that in a quick order before they hit that 65 and above level where they're considered to be on the way out. Our social support schemes, a lot of our social support schemes are predicated on having worked or being in work, so I think maybe some idea of how that might be tweaked, because it's maybe difficult for people to, also society to change so quickly.
Can I? Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I just want to jump in, and I also want to hear Walter's thoughts, I think, on this, right? So I think in the area of employment in particular, I think with population aging, I think the way that society, a country tries to cope with population aging is that you increase opportunities for older adults to continue to work for as long as they would like to, right? And so we do see, for example, on the public policy side, increases in the statutory retirement age as well as the re-employment ages, and they're expected to go up. They increased this year, and they're expected to go up by 2030 even further. But I'm wondering whether there does seem to be a concern, I think, practically, that older adults crowd out younger workers. Now, I think I don't know whether there's research on Singapore on this, but I think internationally the research suggests that that's actually not true, right? That older adults do not crowd out younger workers. But I'm wondering whether there is research on this in Singapore, and whether I think that idea is actually taken, adopted by employers in Singapore. I think particularly this whole idea of having to renegotiate contracts when one is being re-employed at older ages, and having to cut down on working hours and renegotiate the amount of time one works for. I think there's certainly, I think, more room there, I think, for action. It needs to be studied and I think implemented more.
Walter?
Yeah, I guess a couple of observations. I think the first issue is that this discussion we're having about Singapore being rapidly aging, in my view, I think just highlights again the challenge, the difficulty caused by the fact that the numbers we report deliberately, for one reason or another, exclude our huge non-resident migrant population, which is overwhelmingly young, and therefore changes the dynamics of aging in Singapore very differently from that of Korea or Japan, which as many people know, have extremely small non-resident migrant populations, almost negligible in some, in some areas. Whereas Singapore is a huge non-resident migrant population, which will make, so even if Singapore's citizen population ages rapidly, the implications for the labor market, for society and so on, will be quite different, just because we have this ability to bring in all of these people who are young and able-bodied to work. But coming to the area of I guess navigating some of these employment challenges. First, let me touch on the issue that Abhijit mentioned about older worker employment in Singapore and possible substitution or conflict with younger workers. So my thinking is this is actually largely a result of employment legislation and practices which differ widely between countries, where I think the concern that you mentioned about how older workers might make it difficult for younger workers to advance in the career would largely be a result of restrictive employment legislation in some countries that makes it extremely hard to terminate workers in general. And the response to that by employers generally is that they're stuck with the workers they have until the day that they legally retire. And there, in those places, you may have the kind of conflict that you were thinking of. In Singapore, the way that the law is being restructured is actually to deliberately give the employers a way out, which is that we have this curious artifact of the re-employment age, where which is, you know, a number of years before the end of the mandatory re-employment age. So basically what it gives employers the opportunity to do is it gives them a chance to reset the wages and working conditions and terms of employment of an older worker multiple times as they head towards the final age of, you might say, legal retirement. So this additional flexibility, I think, was put in there precisely to avoid this kind of problem of having senior workers who you can't renegotiate or can't get rid of if you need to. That's one. But of course, you know, you have to balance against that the fact that putting in a policy like this will also give employers the ability to, you know, renegotiate terms of older workers at will, which is effectively one of the major complaints that older workers have in Singapore. So I think, if anything, older workers in Singapore quite often perceive that there is actually labor market discrimination against them, rather than perceiving that they are privileged vis-a-vis younger workers. So I think the perception in Singapore is quite different from that in other countries. Then going back to this issue of how do we cope with the aging population in terms of the labor market and so on, to my mind, actually the most challenging part is not so much the oldest old workers. I'm suspecting that the most challenging part we have to deal with is actually middle-aged workers, perhaps young to middle-aged workers, who actually find themselves quite often very stretched. They're very stretched economically and socially because they have ended up, in many cases, actually bearing a lot of the burdens for taking care of both their children as well as their aging parents. And we have, you know, more than a few anecdotes about people in this category who actually find themselves compromising their own careers and so on in order to accommodate these multiple concerns. So they call themselves the sandwich group. And I think it's this group where we probably will have increasing concerns about what are the right policies that will allow them to manage their burdens. And it is a complex problem because some obvious policies we can think of, you know, like maybe elder care leave, for example, or more benefits and, you know, more mandatory requirements for employees to be flexible and so on. You know, the problem with all of these policies is that, and Singaporeans have talked about this, right? Is that inevitably, it will be Singaporeans who end up taking these policies, not foreigners, because generally the foreigners admitted to Singapore to work in these categories. Many of the lower skilled ones are not allowed to bring in the dependents anyway, so they have no dependent problem to work off, to speak of. And employees being who they are, the employers realize that the Singaporean ends up being less productive than their foreign counterpart because the government tells them you have to give all these benefits to the Singaporean, and you know he's off 10 days a year to take care of his parents, 14 days a year to take care of his kids, and so on and so forth. And this is actually one of the challenges. How do we negotiate these kinds of workplaces, you know, with immigration as well as with Singaporeans who bear all of these social and family burdens? And I have to say also in part that these burdens are there because the policy decision in many cases is to place the primary responsibility for many kinds of care with the family, right? So by structural design today, we actually do not have enough subsidized nursing home places for everybody who might need them. And that's a structural design because we actually would prefer that as many elders as possible age in the community, which actually means in practice aging in home with their children having to spend some kind of effort or time to look after them. And that's our structural decision. You could say that maybe this falls in with Asian norms, maybe this is what the elderly and their children want, and I grant you this is probably what a lot of them want, but the end result is that there will be some labor market consequences for their families, and the most obvious group of which, you know, is actually a group of older women today who for gender biased family reasons, often are the ones who find themselves volunteering to take care of their aged parents. And many of them leave their careers at 40, 50 something. They're out of their careers for 5 or 10 years until the aged parents pass on. And what are they going to do at that point? You know, So Aware, I believe, has done a study on this recently, but these are some of the issues we have to think about. Okay, sorry, probably went on for too long on that. Thank you.
It's okay. Thanks, Walter. So encourage everybody to kind of just unmute yourselves and ask questions, or just alternatively post your questions in the chat, and we'll come to them. We've got one now from Daniel. So COVID question is regarding to fertility, complications of anticipating future trends, given that you have this animal zodiac cycle. Okay, so what's the question? It's quite long. Birth rates might interfere with a post-COVID rebound. Okay, yeah. So I think just the following trend from Daniel, go ahead, please.
Okay, so yeah, sorry for the very long question, but yeah, COVID is all about short-term fluctuations in all kinds of demographic rates, and I've been very curious in recent months about the impact of the zodiac cycle, because we're right in the middle now of the year of the tiger, and I've seen fertility rates have plummeted in Taiwan. They're down by about 15%. I don't know about Singapore, but I'm beginning to wonder if that may interfere with any recovery from the birth dearth that may have occurred due to COVID. I'm thinking about Singapore, I'm thinking about China, I'm thinking about Taiwan. So, and I'm also wondering, because of the configuration of the zodiac cycle, the dragon is coming up in 2024, which is supposed to be an auspicious year. So could parents maybe delay fertility all the way to the dragon year of 2024? And could this configuration of COVID and the animal zodiac lead to longer term implications for fertility rates in Asia? So I've been with this topic for a long time, so I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that.
Jean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Can you hear me?
Not very well, Jean. Maybe again, might be closer to the mic.
Sorry, my speaker doesn't seem to be working. Thank you for that question, Daniel. Interesting that you mentioned Taiwan. I think Taiwan is a bit of a different story now with the political uncertainties and economic setback too. A lot of people are deciding not to get married or have babies. So in Singapore, you don't see that kind of big drop of fertility here in this few years, except for the first year and the part of the second year. I think here we probably will continue to see fertility rate going back to pre-COVID level, because there are quite a lot of policies that are from the government trying to address this low fertility issues, and some of them may take effect. One measure is the affordable and high quality daycare arrangement that are more affordable. The other one is really try to address in last 2 years, I think, starting to more seriously address the gender equality issue, by highlighting these issues more upfront. And we also in Singapore have a longer paternity leave. Other Asian countries, in fact, don't have, many of them don't have a paternity leave. Taiwan has about 5 days of paternity leave, or 2 days, I can't remember now. But here we have more, although I would say that we haven't gone far enough. There's a big asymmetry of maternity leave, which is 16 weeks, and paternity leave. My recent research actually showed the positive impact of paternity leave. It has to be 2 weeks. 1 week does not work. 2 weeks that has a positive impact on the family dynamics. People are happier. The women are happier, and fathers spending more time with kids. and they're more involved. And we also see a long-term impact of at age of 6 to 8, kids are actually doing better in terms of some of the test scores we have looked at and behavior problem issues. So I think in this aspect, Singapore has some way to go. I think there need to be a little more balanced paternity leave and maternity leave to help increase the marriage and fertility rate. Other things like people are starting to talk about, making this social pressure less intense for young parents with young children, for the society to become less competitive, and work hours to reduce more. As you know, many of the Asian countries, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Singapore included, are the world's longest work hours, and this is of course not conducive to fertility rate as well. So I think I see COVID as a more short-term fluctuation impact, and long-term wise, we still have to work on these very fundamental issues that are causing this high declining fertility rate and fertility rate. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jean. We've got a couple more questions, one from Facebook and one I think posed by Professor Aris Ananta. So that one was addressed to Walter, and I think you've given a stab back. Do you want to kind of elaborate on that, Walter? And then I'll also come in and maybe make some comments as well.
Yeah, so I think one of the complicating factors is we would probably have to compute the numbers differently depending on what our interest is. So if you were just interested to come up with some high-level number of what percentage of the total population here is aged above a certain level, then you could just kind of guesstimate it by adding back the non-resident population of the prime age and possibly the non-prime age, and estimate it that way. So that's one way of looking at it. But of course, that is not the only way one could look at it, because if you were interested in a different problem, let's say like housing, right? So suppose you're interested in housing supply and demand or something like that, then what has to be accounted for is that a large part of the non-resident population essentially places very little load on housing demand because they are either not allowed by policy to rent, for example, HDB housing or live there, or they don't have the income to actually rent private housing. So I'm talking about our work permit holders and so on. So, basically they have negligible demand for general private residential housing because they're living in work quarters or something of that sort. So I guess the numbers would have to be computed a bit differently depending on what aspect you're actually interested in, which makes it a bit complicated, right? Even for the labor market, there are going to be, one of the challenges is that there are substantial heterogeneity in this group in terms of skills, and that also is important because like Singaporeans are, generally much more sensitive to prime age immigration of high skilled foreigners. They're much less sensitive to low skill immigration because of the perception that it doesn't affect competition for the job that they want, at least for the bulk of medium to higher skilled Singaporeans. So yeah, quite a few issues here to kind of pick apart.
Yeah. Also, maybe if I can add in here, the non-resident population is by definition transient. So they will be continually replenished. They, as Walter says, they are in terms of numbers anyway, more skewed towards the lower skilled. This has certain effects on what people might consider to be the old age support ratio of the population, right? In one hand, you might say that a greater pool of non-permanent resident foreigners in Singapore might be able to provide care to the older population. But in another way, that group is less contributing per capita to the overall economic outcomes of Singapore. So, you know, I think that does change. They also don't age in Singapore. As I said, they're transient, they will leave, right? So we have this revolving pool that kind of keeps that percentage at that level. But the inexorable effect is that we will still have an aging population. It just slows it a bit, unless we increase that number a lot, right? We continue to increase the intake of this non-resident population.
Actually, just briefly on Chris, you know, on that, and I think an interesting related issue is that the pace of assimilation may well have to pick up structurally as well because of some of these issues we're discussing. Because we've been able to maintain a certain pace of PR and citizenship assimilation over the last decade plus. It's been fairly constant, largely because I think of political pressure and so on. But certainly as the baby boomers start passing on, well, not just passing on, but also passing into full-time retirement. The assumptions we made about the rate of assimilation we have may have to be stepped up, especially if we have to replace births as well. And so this again is something that most likely the citizen population will have some difficulty accepting, I would expect. Yeah.
Thanks, Walter. We're getting close to 9 o'clock when I thought we could end this, but maybe as a nice closing question to all of you, Jean, Abhijit, and Walter, is a question from Andrea on Facebook. And she asks, how does Singapore have it all? Both in terms of higher local female labor force participation, a more productive workforce, but also having rising TFR, rising birth rates, and having more people to care for the aged population. So what would be necessary for us to get to this best of all outcomes scenario? So maybe it's a tough question, clearly, but any thoughts, any simple thoughts before we end off this session?
So the question is, how can Singapore have it all, is it?
Yes, I think it is. How does Singapore have it all? Everything, fertility, labor force participation rates for, I guess, women in particular. She asked about women, but also men, I guess. And then also have, a more productive workforce and more people caring for the elderly. Yeah, what are the policies required? Jean, you want to go first? Yeah. Ladies first.
Maybe I can try. I think the short answer is it takes a village. Everyone has to come in to make this work. Having babies, it's not just jobs for women. It's not just job for parents. We see it as having babies as public goods of the society. You need babies to have a sustainable population and vibrant economy. Then the community needs to chip in, the government needs to chip in, and of course family need to chip in. And at the family level, obviously, the recent survey that came out, that's not different from what we already know before. One is the living cost is too high, and that part, government has a hand in that, and they would have to think of how to reduce the burden of parents, and other things like social pressure is too large, and that again, government and schools, the whole and workplace needs to reduce the pressure and create a work culture that is not so competitive. And people need time for family members, taking care of old and the young, you know, it was the aging population that's going to become more and more the burden. Well, the responsibility will become heavier, as Walter talks about. You know, sandwich generation. This sandwich generation is in fact very big. Even for people who are 60s, they're going to have parents that are still alive at 80s and 90s. And so everyone needs more time for family. And so I would always say that we need to have cut down on the really, really long work hours to handle this. And the other factor that people talked about, low for why they're not having babies always, is that it's hard to balance work and family life. And if you read behind, you know, what that means that women are still taking the lion's share of the domestic labors, not just childcare, but you know, housework as well. And we have very clear data shows that the trend has not changed much, and men's participation need to be higher for a functional family, where most of them are dual earners. And in this case, Singapore women are so highly educated, and they want to be, they have a very high aspiration in the workforce too. So all of this really needs saying that both men and women needs to participate, especially providing a lot more incentive for men to participate, and not just as a responsibility, but as a right to spend time with their children and with their aging families as well. So, you know, it takes a village for everyone to work. And of course, immigration at this point is inevitable, and we will need to continue to monitor that very carefully so that Singapore population does not decline and remain a sustainable state.
Thanks, Jean. Abhijit, Walter, you know, either of you really, you know, can go next, but I thought I could take on from what Jean was talking about for both of you. Walter, maybe the point about, you know, competitiveness, right? We are very competitive as a society, but, you know, if we dial down on that competition, what effects might there be on Singapore's productivity then? That's the other thing that Andrea was asking.
Yeah. So maybe I can make the two sets of points. I think one point is today a lot of the policy response to try to have it all, as the questioner asked, you know, high female labor force participation, high fertility, high productivity. Actually, the way we try to manage this right now, maybe somewhat successfully or not, is actually immigration, right? We rely on foreign domestic workers to actually increase labor force participation. We rely on, you know, foreign workers, you know, in our hospitals, healthcare system, and so on, to help ease the burden of taking care of the elderly. And of course, we have lots of low-wage foreign workers, so that in theory, the resident population can take up all of the high-wage, high-productivity jobs, and therefore the numbers look very good. Although we know that low-wage foreign labor creates economic problems of its own. So, you know, for one reason or another, we've structurally seem to have created a web of immigration policy that tries to get us what we want, but may not necessarily succeed in doing all of this perfectly. Okay, so that's one broad point. Then I think on the point about competitiveness, I guess when you want to link it back to some of these concerns we have about fertility and the labor market, the choice that a lot of Singaporeans feel like they have to make is actually quality over everything else. So, you know, there's this famous and old quality quantity trade-off in family formation, family size. And you know, for one reason or another, more Singaporeans feel compelled to choose the quality side of that. In other words, they have very few children and invest a really huge amount of time, energy, and money into those small number of children. And you could argue that this is largely due to the competitive nature of the labor market and the education market, where we have very high stakes testing and where the structure of the economy and rewards is, I would say, quite top heavy, right? So what are we trying to do about this? I think, to the government's credit, it has recognized that it is no longer tenable to just have a system that chugs along with a small number of people getting paid a huge amount. There's a tournament of life, and people who don't do so well in the tournament have very low reward lives. So the government has been trying to change this by, for example, explicitly targeting catching up of the wages of low-income workers through, through essentially minimum wage policies, which I think is a good thing, because I think these kinds of policies reduce some of the disparities that result from a competitive market. But I do suspect we have to go a lot more than this. I don't know whether we need to go all the way to the level of some of the European countries where the wage differentials are much lower between highly skilled and not so highly skilled workers. But I do suspect that, if wage differentials were lower, if status and so on differentials were lower in Singapore, there might be less pressure to keep always choosing the quality side and nothing else basically in your life and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Walter. Abhijit, I think maybe some of the outcomes that we want might be related to a successful aging policy. So maybe over to you. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, some thoughts in closing. One, a high female labor force participation rate, right? So if you look at the numbers in terms of the age-specific female labor force participation rates, female rates go up at the same rate as men until the age of 35 or so. And then while men's labor force participation rates stay near universal, actually female labor force participation rates start dropping at a much faster. So they start dropping when men's don't, and they drop at a faster rate than women, even when men's labor force participation rates drop. Why are women leaving the labor force? It's primarily caregiving responsibilities. So I think in Singapore, while we can, I suppose, in theory have it all, I think this idea of the family being the first point of contact, the first source of care, the focus on familism, I think here, I think has females bearing a disproportionate responsibility for caregiving. And that's caregiving for children, certainly, and I think it's also caregiving for older adults, parents and parents-in-law. That's sort of one aspect of it. I think so. There's the gendered nature of caregiving. I think the second point I wanted to make, I think, and Walter has also said this, which is that the labor market here allows for a very large migrant domestic worker population to come in to also provide support. How can Singapore have it all? Well, there's already talks about how Singapore will need to have more foreign doctors as well as nurses to be able to take care of health needs as they continue to increase. It's even if older adults are living without limitations while they're living longer, they're certainly going to need care. They're going to need support. So I think migrant workers, I think for healthcare, I think are also important. The other sort of aspect of sort of how can Singapore have it all, I think it's various opportunities, I think, in a society like Singapore for social participation, even while transitioning to retirement or post-retirement. And I think there are sort of a whole bunch of different ideas that are discussed in terms of sort of quote unquote successful aging or active or productive aging of older adults. And there are many different pilots, different ideas, small ideas that are being tried, and some organizations, etc., trying to see whether they can be scaled up from small geographies or neighborhoods, from a few centers to island wide. So yeah, I mean those are just some final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Abhijit. So I think all of the speakers have talked about some of the things that might be needed. I come back to what Jane said earlier. It probably takes a village, and we cast the village as the whole island, the whole country. I think that might make sense. Some experiments, as Abhijit mentioned, in terms of trialing new things. We have the Queenstown Health District project that's going to be launched, and we'll learn a lot more about how Singapore is aging around that. So yeah, lots of things to do. We've gone past our well past our end time. Thanks to the speakers, Jean, Abhijit, and Walter, for giving up your evening and sacrificing your family time to be with us tonight. And thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. Yeah, thank you for attending the session organized by the Population Association of Singapore. Good night, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.